Good afternoon. My name is Charles Fallhaber, and I'm the interim director of the Bancroft Library. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon on behalf of the Friends of the Bancroft Library. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping hints. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and you can submit questions at any time in the Q&A tab on the control panel at the bottom of your screen. We also have closed captioning, and if you would like to watch that, you can click again on the CC tab, also at the bottom of the screen. We are recording, and we will share a private link to the video as soon as possible. This Saturday, February 19th, is the 80th anniversary of Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. This mandated that roughly 110,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, should be sent to internal exile in 10 camps as far east as Arkansas. The federal government called them internment camps. We call them incarceration camps, concentration camps, whatever you call them, they were prisons. The current Bancroft exhibition, Uprooted: The Incarceration of Japanese Americans, tells the story of this event in words, documents, and pictures. It covers the relocation process, the original detention centers like the Tanforan racetrack in San Mateo. There were the internees were sent originally, then the life and art of the camps, the violence in the camps, the experience of the young soldiers joining the military, and then after the war, the efforts to achieve redress, some sort of compensation for the people who had been incarcerated. Daniel James Brown's Facing the Mountain tells the story of the incarceration, but especially of the young men who volunteered for the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team that fought in Italy and France in 1944 and 1945. It follows particularly the stories of 4 of these young men who fought, but also of one young man who challenged the incarceration order, the statute 9066, in court, lost, was jailed, and finally was exonerated by the Supreme Court much, much later. Dan is a native of Berkeley. He's a Cal grad. And he has spoken of how a long rainy winter he spent in the Dole Library while he was still in high school transformed his life. He majored in English with a BA in 1974, took a master's in English at UCLA in 1977, then returned to the Bay Area and taught writing at San Jose State and Stanford for about 12 years. At the end of that period, he also began moonlighting for an educational software company. This led to a job at Microsoft in 1988 as a technical writer and eventually a manager. While still at Microsoft, he began to write almost as a hobby his first book about the Hinckley, Minnesota firestorm of 1894, which killed 2,000 people, including his own great-grandfather. In the process, Dan discovered his true vocation as a writer of documentary nonfiction books about historical events, a genre that he has made peculiarly his own over the last 15 years. His second book was about Sarah Graves Fosdick, who was a member of the ill-fated Donner Party of 1846, marooned at Donner Lake in the Sierra Nevada. The Boys in the Boat, the third book, 2013, told the story of the University of Washington crew that won Olympic gold in the 1936 Berlin Olympics and spent over 135 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. This afternoon, Dan is going to talk about Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II, also a New York Times bestseller. Dan will be joined by the writer of the preface to that book, Tom Ikeda. Tom was the founding executive director of Densho, a position from which he will be stepping down this summer after 26 years. In Japanese, Densho means to pass on to the next generation. Founded in Seattle, but now a national organization, it is dedicated to preserving the memories of those Japanese Americans who were incarcerated in World War II and using those memories to inspire current and future generations of Americans to action. Tom is a native of Seattle, and his own parents were incarcerated. Trained as an engineer at the University of Washington, he first worked on artificial kidneys in a company in Walnut Creek in the Bay Area, returned to the University of Washington for an MBA, and in the early 80s ran a Seattle trade show for personal computers about the time the original IBM PC appeared. This caught the attention of Microsoft as well, and he went to work for that company in 1988. He left Microsoft in 1992 to become a stay-at-home dad, and in 1996 agreed to join a group to explore the possibility of an oral history project to record the stories of Japanese Americans imprisoned in World War II, people then in their 70s and 80s. This became Densho, inspired in part by Steven Spielberg's Shoah Holocaust Oral History Project. Tom has personally conducted over 250 oral histories, and he and Densho were important sources for Facing the Mountain. Gentlemen, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Charles. I just, before you jump in, Tom, I just want to thank all of you for being here today, of course. But I also wanted to make a point of saying how very important the libraries at Cal have been to me all my life. As Charles mentioned, even before I was a student at Berkeley, I spent a great deal of time in Doe Library, and it really changed my life in ways I won't get into in great detail here. But I'm a huge fan of the library system at Cal, and so I'm so glad all of you are here today to help support that. As Charles mentioned, Tom has for over 25 years been running Densho, basically collecting, videotaping, and curating and making available to the public through his website the oral histories of Japanese Americans, particularly during the World War II years. And it's an incredible amount of work that he's done, and Densho is an incredible resource. And it was when I met Tom that I first started thinking about writing a book about the Japanese American experience during the war. And in fact, I went home the night after I met Tom, and I got on his website and I started listening to the oral histories that he had collected. And I was just absolutely blown away by the stories I was hearing. They were deeply felt stories. In many ways, they were the kind of stories that really draw me in as a writer. They were stories about perseverance and resilience and ordinary Americans confronting really difficult circumstances and having to overcome them. In this case, all Japanese Americans. And so it was only after I met Tom and I started listening to these firsthand oral histories that I got really, really interested in writing a book about that subject. So I spent the next year basically going back and forth with Tom, trying to narrow the topic down. I didn't want to write a complete comprehensive history of the Japanese American experience. For one thing, that'd be really presumptuous of somebody like me. But also it's not what I do. What I do is I try to find people from history, write portraits of them that shed some light on a slice of history that I think needs to be brought alive again for readers. So Tom and I went back and forth for about a year trying to narrow the scope down. And I wound up on focusing on 4 young Japanese American men. I was interested in young men. The book also deals very much with their families, but I wanted the focus of the book to be young men because I felt that at the beginning of the war, after Executive 9066 was issued, all Japanese Americans confronted a really difficult situation, of course. But young men of draft age had a particularly difficult thing to deal with. All their high school friends, their buddies, their neighbors were all going off to war at the same time that they and their families were being led away to be put into what are basically concentration camps. So what do you do if you're a young man and you're in that situation? That question really interested me, and I wanted to explore it. So going back and forth with Tom, I wound up with these 4 individuals that became the focus of the book, and it's really built around their lives. And I think maybe we have Tom back. I see him up at the top of my screen there.
Yeah, Dan, I'm back. It's sort of Murphy's Law. To get better internet connection, I went to the office, and then our office internet just went down as Charles was doing the introductions. And so I'm on a Wi-Fi now, but it's a little shaky. And
okay.
So but are you hearing me okay?
I'm hearing you okay, and so I'm going to assume the audience is as well. So I was just talking about how we met and how I began to look at the Densho archives and how that inspired me to write the book, and how you and I went back and forth, over a course of a year or so, trying to narrow it down, and I wound up writing about the 4 guys. So we're going to talk about here this afternoon. Actually, the first young man I'm going to talk about was a young man named Gordon Hirabayashi, whose name you may have heard. His legal case wound up in the Supreme Court, and along with Fred Korematsu's case, became extremely important pieces of history. Gordon Hirabayashi was a student at the University of Washington when the war began. He was an unusual young man. He was a young man of very strong principles, a young man who lived very much by his principles. He was already a conscientious objector before the war began. But he was particularly concerned when the Roosevelt administration took the actions that it did. And he knew pretty quickly that he was not going to be able to do what most other Japanese Americans were doing. The first thing that happened with Japanese Americans in Seattle and in many other cities on the West Coast was that a curfew was imposed, an 8 p.m. curfew was imposed on anybody of Japanese descent, American citizens or not. They were not allowed to be out on the street after 8 p.m. So Gordon, at first week or so, he obeyed that curfew, but then he was, as I say, a student at the University of Washington, and he was in the library studying with some friends one evening, and his friend said, "You better go home, it's curfew time." So he started home, and partway across the campus, he realized that, he started to question himself. Why should I be the one? I'm an American citizen. Why am I getting up and leaving, going back home when all my schoolmates are still there in the library, doing their work? And it came a sort of a revelation to him, a sudden revelation to him. And he turned around, he went back, he sat down, and he kept working in the library. And from that point forward, he began to deliberately violate the curfew. In fact, he began to keep a diary in which he documented the occasions on which he was out after 8 p.m. So there would be a record of his violations of the curfew. And that was the beginning of Gordon's resistance, but it was far from the end. He, when the day came for Japanese Americans to be rounded up, put on buses and taken away to these camps, Gordon just didn't get on the bus. Instead, he sat down. He was now the last Japanese American living in Seattle. He sat down and wrote out a statement addressed to the FBI. And in this statement, he very carefully articulated the reasons why he felt that the incarceration of American citizens was unconstitutional, and he didn't intend to obey it. He took that statement, he went downtown Seattle, he walked into the FBI offices there, he handed this paper, this statement to the agent in charge of the office, who was completely confounded. He didn't know what to make of this young man. Every other Japanese American up and down the coast had signed the registration, gotten on the buses, gone to camp. Gordon wouldn't do it. So they spent the rest of that day driving Gordon around Seattle to various locations, trying to get him to sign this registration form. And he wouldn't do it. So he spent that night in the King County Jail. And that was just the beginning of a long legal battle that led up ultimately to the Supreme Court, as I mentioned earlier. And I see we have Tom again. We'll try and see if it's working on his end now.
Yeah, so Dan, let me see if I can play the video.
Sure.
And if it's not working, could the folks at Berkeley, I sent you videos, and it's going to be that first clip of Gordon Hirabayashi.
And then one day, I'm dashing home. Hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff, and it takes about 5 minutes to get home. So I'm just dashing home, and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, without saying I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
Great. Yeah, thanks for showing that clip. And if you could stop sharing, we'll go back on. And because my internet connection is really slow, I'm not sharing my my video. But so Dan, I'm sorry, I was off and on, so I wasn't able to hear everything. And thank you for carrying the show. I mean, you're such a pro that you can do this. This is by far the most difficult technical we've had so far.
It was bound to happen sooner or later, Tom.
I know. So Gordon is you chose him because of his his resistance, his civil disobedience against the government. A pretty extraordinary, courageous stand on his part. And as you were saying, not only for the curfew, but for the the exclusion orders, the orders to leave Seattle in his case, and go to he was scheduled to go to Minidoka, and his family went to Tule Lake. But you also in your book talk about courage in a different way. The men who went into the 442. And so let's go to Hawaii and talk about Katz Miho, because I'm so glad that you did the Japanese American experience in Japan, because what people sometimes don't realize is there were more Japanese Americans in Hawaii than there was on the West Coast. And oftentimes their story doesn't get told as much because for the most part, they were not removed and incarcerated. And you were able to tell the story through, Katz Miho. So, talk about Katz Miho and his story.
Yeah, so Katz, another really remarkable young man. Katz grew up on Maui at a time when Maui and all the islands basically were run as large sugarcane and pineapple plantations, sugarcane especially. So Katz grew up on Kahului, the main town on Maui, but at a time when it was a plantation town, basically, very different from Maui today. But when Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941, Katz was actually a student at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. And yeah, this is a picture of him playing football for Maui High, which was one of his passions. But he was a student at the University of Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. And in fact, he witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor from the roof of his residence hall. Looking north, he could see the pillars of smoke coming up, and in fact, a bomb fell quite close to his residence hall. So Katz immediately, he was a member of the ROTC at the University of Hawaii. So he ran across the street to the campus and joined several hundred other young ROTC cadets milling around in the auditorium there at the university, while as they all tried to figure out what to do. They were being attacked by Japan. Most of these ROTC kids were, by the way, Japanese Americans. There were other ethnicities too, but the largest slice of them were Japanese Americans. So that it was a pretty panicked situation. They issued these old 1903, I think it was, vintage rifles to these kids, and they had never shot them. They didn't know how even to load them. Because everybody expected an imminent invasion of Hawaii by the Japanese imperial forces. So that night, Katz found himself a member of what quickly became the Hawaii Territorial Guard, just a unit created that afternoon. He found himself down on the waterfront in Honolulu, patrolling in the dark, carrying this old rifle against, as I say, an expected invasion by the Japanese. And it was a traumatic moment for Katz and for all Japanese people in Hawaii. It was the moment people realized that these were Japanese planes overhead, all kinds of issues arose in their lives. But as he was down there patrolling that night, what he didn't know was that his father was being led away at gunpoint from the hotel on Maui that he ran. So Katz was very proud to be in uniform. He was very proud to be a member of the Hawaii Territorial Guard. But that all ended very abruptly one night, not long into his service. And do we have that clip? Are we able to play the Katz Miho clip?
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts. And for 2-3 nights in a row, we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, this is the way how you lock it in case anything happens. And to this day, I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to, because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do, because we were not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. We dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the adjutant commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, he says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans or Japanese, I'm pretty sure he referred to it, Americans or Japanese ancestry, because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged herein right off the bat, right as of now, you have been discharged from the Hawaiian Territory. Only the AJAs. I'm completely still in shock.
Yeah, you know, Katz talks about being in a state of shock because they were suddenly thrown out of the territorial guard and take their guns and their uniforms were taken away. A lot of the guys that were there that morning in the pre-dawn darkness said they could hear other of these young men around them in the dark crying. They were so shocked and so upset that they were not being allowed to serve. So Katz went back to Maui, got a construction job, was absolutely demoralized and depressed. But a year later, the Roosevelt administration finally began to allow Japanese Americans to enlist. Up until this point, when Japanese American kids went down to enlist, they were told they couldn't, that they were considered enemy aliens, even though they were American citizens. But in February of 1943, the Roosevelt administration created the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which joined the 100th Infantry as all Japanese American units, a pre-existing unit from before the war. And so finally, Japanese Americans were able to enlist at that point.
And so, Dan, this is probably a good point. I think my internet's back up, so hopefully this is going to work. But now would be a good time to move over to Rudy. Go down back to the mainland in California. So, Gordon, earlier really represented a role in terms of kind of resisting the government. We had Katz in Hawaii to catch the Japanese American experience in Hawaii. And then you have Rudy Tokiwa, who both of us really enjoy because he's kind of a rascally type of character. But he kind of represents what happened to many Japanese Americans on the West Coast. So pick up the story in terms of him and Salinas and what happened to him and his family.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Rudy grew up on a farm in Salinas, not far from where I am right now, as a matter of fact. Grew up on a farm, and when the executive order was issued, he and his family were removed from their homes, sent first to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, which was an assembly center, and then they were shipped down to Poston, Arizona, to one of the larger camps there, particularly hot, dry, miserable, dusty camp, absolutely a horrible place, of course, to be incarcerated, particularly in the summer. But while he was at Poston with his family, as I say, the Roosevelt administration decided to allow Japanese Americans to start enlisting. And this set off a huge debate within the camps, among the young men in the camps in particular. Many of them felt the last thing in the world they should do was enlist to fight for a government that had incarcerated them and their parents and their grandparents and all their loved ones. Other young men in the camps said that, well, maybe if we enlist and we serve and we fight and we bleed and perhaps even die in this war, that when the war is over, people won't be able to discriminate against Japanese Americans anymore. We will have proved to the American people and to this government that has done this that we are loyal Americans. So there's a huge amount of debate and very strong feelings on both sides about that. In Poston, a day came when all the young men 16 and over gathered under some mesquite trees down in a wash at Poston and had it out, debated this. Rudy was one of those that stood up and argued for enlisting in the 442nd. As I say, arguing that if he did that, when he came back, there was no way he could face the kind of discrimination that he and his family had faced up to that point. So Rudy enlisted in the 442nd. The 442nd was shipped. At first, they went to basic training at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, where a very interesting conflict arose between the kids from Hawaii and the kids from the mainland who didn't get along at all, and that's treated in the book. But ultimately, they did come together as a fighting force. They were shipped first to Italy. They fought their way up the Italian boot from Anzio up to the Arno River, series of pitched battles, very bloody battles. And they won a lot of honors. They became an extremely effective fighting force, and to the point that the Germans became seriously worried about facing them. But then in the fall of 1944, as the Allies were beginning to close in on the German border, they were shipped north to the Franco-German border, actually about 30 miles inside France, facing the border, to the Vosges forest, which is a mountainous, dark, impenetrable region. And they were tasked with pushing into the Vosges forest, into these mountains, to try to push the Germans back. And in particular, they were given the assignment of liberating a town called Bruyères, where a highway and a railroad intersected. So at this point, it's October of 1944. It's raining, it's miserably cold, it's snowing, raining, sleeting. So they fight this horrific battle and finally liberate this French town. They are pushed past Bruyères, deeper into the Vosges forest, come to a place called Bifontaine and a town called Belmont, liberate those. And then they are finally, after taking heavy casualties, they're told they can take a couple nights of rest. So they go off and they crawl into barns and cellars and any place dry they can find to try to get some rest. But in the middle of the next night, they are awakened and told to put their combat gear back on, that they have a mission. And what happened was that in the intervening days, General Dahlquist, the commanding general, had sent a unit of Texas soldiers, mostly from Texas and Oklahoma. He had sent them into the Vosges along a ridgetop and further into the Vosges than they should have gone. They'd been cut off, surrounded by the Germans. They suffered very heavy casualties. They'd run out of food and medicine. A number of them had died and were dying, and they were in a terrible plight. General Dahlquist sent several other units over a couple of days of his Texas division up to try to break through and get them out. Nobody could. So finally, he woke up the Nisei soldiers, the Japanese-American soldiers of the 442nd, and sent them up that mountain to try to get through to the Texans. And it was an absolutely extraordinary battle. It went on for days. They fought their way up this mountain, taking extremely heavy casualties. But they did finally break through and reach the Texans and get them down off the mountain. Although they themselves were not allowed to come off the mountain. They had to fight on, and it was several more days of combat before they finally were pulled back down out of the mountains. At that point, they had been basically decimated. There were so many of them had been injured or were killed that their ranks were enormously thinned. And nevertheless, General Dahlquist ordered a retreat parade. So he ordered them to line up so that he could pass in review of them.
And so Dan, I think we have a clip to show this. So let me set this up just a little bit. So at full strength, the 442nd 100th is about 4,000 men, and that includes 3 infantry units and a headquarters unit and artillery. On that day, because of what you just described and the heavy casualties they took, there were only about 700 to 800 men left. But General Dahlquist, who called the retreat parade, essentially wanting the men to parade in front of him, he was expecting probably a couple thousand at least. And so when he only saw just a few hundred, he actually got upset. And so this next clip we're going to show you is of Rudy Tokiwa, the kid from Salinas, who talks about this retreat parade and the reaction of General Dahlquist. So go ahead and go to the next slide.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
I'm glad my internet's working now, so I could, kind of talk about this clip. I interviewed Rudy about 25 years ago, and I still recall to this day, that interview, and because he goes on, and I remember him, really, continuing to cry about, all of the men that his friends that were lost, and also the hurt, because he felt so disrespected by the general and others, that his family was still in an American concentration camp, and so many of his buddies were gone, and they weren't even being acknowledged. I came in late, so I really didn't get a chance to talk about a little bit about Densho, what we're doing, but essentially the clips you're watching are the stories that Densho has been collecting for the last 26 years. Our belief was that if we could collect these stories and have them available for people like Dan and others to see, it would be a powerful reminder of what our country did, 26 or 80 years ago now, in terms of, the commemoration of the Executive Order 9066. But Dan, I know this clip was something that you saw early too, and want to get your thoughts about this.
Yeah, the Rudy clip was one of the, I remember the day that I saw it. My wife was in the room with me, and I started to tear up, and she started to tear up, because as you say, as Rudy goes on, he's continuing to tear up. And that's about to tear up thinking about it. Particularly as I then dove into the subject and got to know Rudy through all the interviews you did with him and through talking to his family members, it just really made a huge impact on me. The emotional impact, of course, that war has on young men, but particularly that these very unfair circumstances had on these families and these young men. So there are so many great videos in your collection, Tom. But when I saw that one, I knew that one way or another, I was going to write a book around this subject, because I was so moved by it.
So let's move to the fourth person in this presentation, Fred Shiosaki. So we're going back to Washington State, but in this case, Eastern Washington. And we talked about earlier about 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast being removed and placed in American concentration camps. Fred lived in Eastern Washington, which was far enough from the West, from the coast, that the Japanese Americans weren't removed and incarcerated. And so his story is a little bit different. And I know Fred is one of your favorites, Dan. So tell me about Fred, or Rosie, and his story.
Yeah, I am very fond of Fred, partly because of the 4 guys that I profiled in the book, Fred was the only one who was still alive when I started. And so I was able to spend quite a bit of time with him. And he recently passed away. But Fred was, Fred's family his parents were immigrants from Japan, of course, and a very hardworking couple. they ran a laundry in Spokane, and they had an apartment upstairs over the laundry. So Fred grew up in this laundry in Spokane, going to Rogers High School in Spokane, where he was on the photography club and played sandlot baseball with all his friends. Very, in many ways, very typical American, upbringing. He was, Fred, his personality, he was really very soft-spoken and gentle until you got his dander up. And then he was just as tough as nails. In fact, growing up in Spokane, he got picked on, by other kids. He got racial epithets hurled at him, and he'd fight back. And so he was always getting his glasses broken, because he'd come home and ask his dad for a new pair of glasses because another pair had been broken. But anyway, so Fred enlisted in the 442nd. He had gone down first and tried to enlist, been told he was an enemy alien, which was devastating to him. But a year later, he was able to enlist in the 442nd. And he wound up serving in the same company as Rudy Tokiwa, which was K Company, which was one of the lead companies that went up that mountain in order to rescue the Texas battalions. On the way up the mountain in that battle, he lost a lot of friends. As I said earlier, it was a very bloody battle. A close friend of Fred's got hit right next to Fred as he was going up the mountain. And so it was a really hard and traumatic thing for him, and as it was for all of them. And I think we have that clip in the train station.
Yeah, so we chose a clip to kind of show some of the the psychological impacts of the fighting. And so this is a clip of Fred returning home after the war, and he's in Washington D.C. at the train station, kind of waiting for a transfer, when a soldier, someone from that Texan unit that they rescued, comes up to him. So let's go to the next slide and listen to this.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington D.C. And I was actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out, I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were the 442nd?" Yeah. He says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah, anyway, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, if you guys were in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, I remember that interview with Fred. I was actually surprised by his response of just turning away. I was expecting him to maybe reach out and shake that hand. And Fred goes on and talks about, he just said it was so unlike him, but he was just so angry. He said he just something just snapped in him that it wouldn't let him shake that hand. And it kind of gets to that issue of kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome. He didn't they didn't call it back then anything like that with a label, but you talk about these guys, the nightmares they had and how difficult. I mean, what was your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, Fred talked about after the war, got back to the laundry. He moved back in with his parents for a while. I think he was going to Gonzaga University, and his mom had to keep waking him up in the middle of the night because he was screaming in his sleep. So, and all these guys, almost all of them, that if you follow their tales through, if you listen to their oral histories after the war, they had a really hard time coming back into civilian life, as veterans of all wars do. All of them suffered to some extent from PTSD. And as you say, I mean, it's so uncharacteristic of Fred, of all people, to not shake somebody's hand. It shows the amount of anger that was there, and that it took a long time to sort of process that and work through it.
No, thanks, Dan. And, and thanks, we just want to give the audience a sense of, these four men. We want to now move the program to the Q&A portion. And so at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. And so if you have any questions for Dan or for me, why don't you write that down in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And while people are doing that, let me ask you a question, Dan, because we've been working on this for over 6 years, and that's when we met. And these past 6 years have also coincided with a lot of social and political upheaval in our country. And there were things happening that, and we would talk about this, that kind of rhymed with what happened with Japanese Americans during World War II. I mean, I remember, early on, and this was right when, at that point, the candidate Trump was running for president, and he came out talking about the rapists and murderers from Mexico. And I remember we were talking, I said, you know what, this rhetoric is very similar to what Chinese and Japanese had to face when they first immigrated in the 1800s and early 1900s. And then later on, as it went later on, some of the negative rhetoric that against just Asian Americans and Asians later on as the book was starting to come out. We also had things like the Muslim travel ban, which was an instance where national security was used as a reason to actually treat a group differently than everyone else in terms of traveling and coming into the country. Muslims were treated differently. And so that was something else that kind of rhymed with what happened to Japanese Americans. And then we saw on the southern border, families being detained and separated and placed in detention centers that were a little reminiscent of the American concentration camps that Japanese Americans. I guess the question is as this is all happening, how does that impact you and your writing of Facing the Mountain?
Yeah, I mean, it was very conspicuous for me. By day, I was reading about these hardworking Japanese immigrant families coming to this country and struggling. And then I'd go home and I'd watch, the news and hear all this anti-immigrant rhetoric. And the same thing with, mass incarcerations of children in cages. At the same time, I was reading about families being incarcerated. There's all these echoes as I was writing the book, with stuff actually happening in the world around me. And it was depressing to realize that so many of these issues are still out there. But it was also, of course, energizing. It made me all the more determined to write the book. It's not that it changed the content of the book any, really, but it certainly gave me more impetus to make sure that I was telling this piece of history honestly, which I think is enormously important, particularly these days when the whole notion of teaching history honestly seems to be under attack. I'm just sorry, but that just fires me up. I'm gonna teach it as uncomfortable as it might be. I'm going to teach history through my writing as things actually happen. So yeah, I mean, and we were talking about the rhetoric. I mean, that's maybe the most depressing thing for me was that, anti-Asian rhetoric goes back, and this is particularly relevant in the Bay Area, because in many ways, there's no place that it was more prevalent than in San Francisco. When the Chinese began to show up in California after the gold rush or during the gold rush, there was so much anti-Chinese, anti-Asian rhetoric and actual violence directed at them. And then this whole era where this notion of the yellow peril came up that was promulgated largely in the San Francisco press and many other places. There were certain tropes and images and associations that that arose in American consciousness, equating Asians with locusts and rats and snakes and plagues and bringers of disease. That, and all that came up again after Pearl Harbor. But then it all began to come up again more recently, the same images and tropes and associations with disease and so forth. So in many ways, it's the language that and these tropes that have gotten embedded in American consciousness that concern me the most.
Great, no, great answer. Yeah, I'm looking at the questions coming from the audience, and there's one that kind of stood out because we haven't had this question before, and it's from Marilyn, who asks, did the book No No Boys influence Facing the Mountain? And the book No No Boys, it's a little bit of a confusing name, but it's essentially a novel written by John Okada about the giraffe resistors. And I'm not sure if you've read that book, Dan, but I guess the question is, the story of the giraffe resistors and how that influenced Facing the Mountain.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have read it. It's a great book, wonderful book, and everybody should promptly read it. I don't think it really influenced the writing Facing the Mountain. One of the things, and Tom, this from working with me, I had to make a certain amount of trade-offs about what I could cover and what I couldn't cover and still construct a coherent narrative. So for instance, there's a whole story of the military intelligence service that Japanese Americans served in. There's a whole story of the 100th Infantry Battalion that I couldn't really get into without bringing too many characters in. But there was also, very importantly, the story of the resistors. And so, I talk about Gordon Hirabayashi, who's a little different in some ways from the No No Boys. Gordon was opposed and resisted from the get-go. The No No Boys were basically young men who, in the camps, who refused to sign the loyalty oath and or be conscripted. And their resistance was palpable. It caused them to be arrested and to be tried in sort of mass trials in different places around the country. So while I talk about that in the book, it's not one of my focuses, but it's really important part of the history.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the interesting part for me when we first started talking was, and you probably said this in your intro, I mean, the story is just so large and it encompasses so much, and you had to narrow it so something that could be in a book, because not only did we talk about the giraffe resistors, but the whole issue with Tule Lake and the loyalty questionnaire could be a book in itself. Over the weekend, someone bent my ear about how your book didn't really cover the MIS, in terms of Japanese American Pacific, and how much more important that story is than the World War II. And so it goes on and on. So,
Yep.
But here's another question. Earlier on, when you were talking about General Dahlquist, and the question is, because of his terrible leadership, quote, terrible leadership, was he ever called out for that? Was he ever reprimanded because of his leadership?
I don't believe that he was formally. I know that he earned the enmity of the Japanese American troops who served under him. I mean, for the rest of their lives, I've yet to find any of these guys who had anything good to say about General Dahlquist. Unlike, Lieutenant Colonel Purcell, there were some of their officers, their white officers, who they actually genuinely liked and admired. They had no use for Purcell at all. I don't think he was reprimanded in any way. Interestingly, he was in trouble, though, before the Lost Battalion, and I don't remember the details of this, but he had made some blunders in Italy earlier in the campaign that had very much upset the brass above him. And so he was on sort of thin ice going into the Lost Battalion situation, which I think may account for his over-aggressiveness in sending those Texans so deep into the Vosges and then being so desperate to get them out of there that many more people died trying to get them out than were actually in there. So I suspect he was already in hot water before that even happened.
Yeah, I remember, interviewing some of the men, and there was a distinct difference in terms of how they talked about General Dahlquist versus, say, a General Mark C. Clark in terms of the respect they had for the different commanders. Yeah, I just want to let the audience know that we recognize that it's 5 o'clock right now, and this was supposed to go for an hour. And we had some technical difficulties in the beginning, so things got off to a little slow start. But if you need to get leave, feel free to do that. But I just want to let others know that we will continue to answer questions for another about 10 minutes or so if you're able to stay around. And again, I apologize for the earlier technical difficulties. It sort of threw us off there. So let's go back to the questions. I'm kind of just jumping around, but here's one that we just were talking about earlier this week, Dan, and the question was, it disappeared, but maybe it was answered. But someone asked, "Is the film still on?"
So the Facing the Mountain film.
Right. Well, I guess you could talk both about The Boys on the Boat and Facing the Mountain, but let's start with Facing the Mountain.
Yeah, so we'll see. I am talking to some people in Hollywood, and actually took a big step forward yesterday towards the possibility, I think maybe it's even a probability at this point, of a film. Actually, what we're talking about doing is a series, an HBO style series, because a feature film is an hour and 50 minutes or something like that. The director I'm talking to and the other people, the executives, we really want to be able to tell this story on a bigger scale. So we need more than an hour and a half. We want to be able to talk about the immigrant experience of the Japanese to Hawaii and to the West Coast. We want viewers to get to know Fred and Rudy and Gordon and Katz and the other cast of characters around them before they get into the war situation. So we're thinking in terms, actually we're talking in terms of a series of maybe probably 2 or maybe even 3 seasons of episodes. So sort of big scale, epic kind of thing. So we'll see. I mean, Hollywood's Hollywood. It takes a long time for things to happen down there sometimes, sometimes not. And you never know for sure. But yeah, there's progress in that direction. There's also Boys in the Boat, I have to pitch, movie that George Clooney is directing that is going to go into production next month.
Great. So we forgot to talk about this. Someone asked about the title of the book, Dan, and how you came up with that.
Yeah, so actually I should credit my wife, Sharon. I'm I'm terrible with titles, as my publisher and my agent are well aware. I always propose very flowery metaphorical titles, and they always want something more literal and hard-hitting. This one actually is relatively metaphorical, I guess. For me, my wife suggested it and it stuck. For me, it is sort of a couple levels on which it works. One is just a topographical level. The fact is that these Nisei troops were always fighting their way uphill, both in Italy and France and Germany. The Germans always had the high ground. The Nisei troops were always having to fight uphill against, fire coming downhill at them, which is extremely difficult. So it sort of makes sense on that level. But more metaphorically and more generally, to me, if you think about it, Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, Issei and Nisei, December 6th, 1941, they're going about their lives. On December 7th, this mountain of problems arises in their path. And it's a really difficult set of circumstances that they have to come to terms with and overcome. And they have to find some way around or over or through that mountain. And so for me, it's really that. It's facing this very difficult situation that generation, those generations of Japanese and Japanese Americans faced, and how they had to overcome them.
Here's a question from Masumoto, and the question is, how will the memory of this, this history or this past impact Japanese American families and their sense of being American? And so, Dan, I'm going to take a stab at this because I've I have some thoughts about this, and it comes from working with you. During the introductions, it was mentioned that I've been doing this work for over 26 years, and during that time, I really dived deeply into the history, of Japanese Americans, especially during World War II. But what I recognized, prior to working with you, was how much siloed I had become in thinking of it as Japanese American history. I think it was really valuable these last few years working with you, because you really approached it from a different perspective. You really treated it as an American story, not as a Japanese American story. And this gets, I think, to your question, Mas, in terms of, how will this past, impact Japanese Americans? For me, it was a recognition that, even though it felt like a community story to me, because I kind of knew the people and the families, it was recognizing that this is a really powerful American story, and this is American history. So it did shift for me, kind of that sense of being American that I didn't really have until I worked with you, Dan. So I just wanted to say thank you, because it did help me kind of bring a broader perspective of the story.
It's interesting. Yeah, actually, the director I'm talking to in Hollywood is Japanese American, and he said almost exactly the same thing yesterday when I was talking to him. So that's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a question for you. Can you explain how the members of the 442nd could be so effective as a fighting force for a country which had treated them so badly? So what made this 442 so special?
That's really what makes them remarkable. Is you have to, I think, to appreciate this, you literally have to take a moment and put yourself in their position and imagine that your family, your actual family, your grandmother and your children and you and your spouse and your brother and your sister are all being put in a concentration camp. And yet you decide to serve the country for which that has done that to you. That's the remarkable thing about this when you get right down to the crux of it. In terms of how they became so effective, I think that's part of it. I mean, they all had this common, well, they weren't all incarcerated, so I can't say they all came out of the camps with the same attitude, but they all, by the time they were knit together at basic training, they all had this common identity, that they knew there was a wrong that had been perpetrated, and they were determined to do what they could to right that wrong, and to defend democracy and to be American. So I think, there was a cohesiveness. Didn't start off that way. They were not all cohesive when they came together in basic training in Mississippi, very much the opposite. But by the time they got to Italy and set foot on Italian soil and came under fire, and coming under fire itself tends to knit people together. They became an extraordinary fighting force, as has often been said, for a unit of its size and its length of service. It appears to have been the most decorated unit in American military history, not just in World War II, but in American military history. They won in the long run an extraordinary number of honors. It took decades for many of those honors to actually be conferred upon them, though.
Well, and there's something else that you wrote in the book that I like, that I think also gets to this. It was in the epilogue where you also talked about these men as having these strong, these Nisei men, really strong American values, and yet they also carried a lot of their Japanese culture with them too. And it's kind of the same, I think, discussions we're having today about immigrants in our country today. I mean, there are a lot of people here who feel like immigration is bad, and these immigrants aren't really good for the country. And yet, in this case, you captured so well, I think, in your writing, how bringing some of the values from Japan, made them kind of a special group also.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these kids had grown up watching samurai movies and learning about the code of the samurai, for instance. And you can overstate this because some of them weren't, but there were certain Japanese qualities and values that their parents, gamen and other things that their fathers and their mothers taught them that helped them as soldiers. One of the things that was really striking listening to all your interviews, Tom, of the guys who served, almost to a man, when they left home to go join the army, the last thing their father said to them was some version of, well, do well. I hope you come back uninjured. We love you. But whatever you do, don't bring dishonor on your family or on your country. And when it came to that moment when they had to charge up that mountain into the face of all that fire coming downhill at them to rescue those Texans, that actually made a difference for a lot of them. A lot of them got up and ran into that fire thinking about what their fathers had said before they got in the train back in Los Angeles or Seattle or wherever.
Yeah, that's good. Here's a question from Amanda, and after thanking us for thanking me for recording these stories and for you writing the book, the question for you, Dan, is how did you think about telling these stories about Japanese Americans as someone who was outside of the community? And so, how did you prepare for this? How did you deal with this? Being outside the community, talking about this Japanese American story.
Yeah, so I mean, that was, obviously one of the very first things that came up. I remember you and I talked about it very early on, that was something I really needed to think about. I think it was only when I started talking to the actual family members of the guys I was going to write about, and found that they were eager for me to tell their father or their grandfather's stories, that for one thing, we were so connected on a human level, and I realized this is going to be a human story. And absolutely, I am an outsider and I need to keep that in mind. But I'm also a father and a brother and a husband. And so I have a lot of common experiences with the people that I'm writing about. And it's just deeply human on that level. So, I think it was really important, and it continues to be really important for me to acknowledge that that I'm not a member of the community that I'm writing about. I think it's been really important to spend a lot of time listening to people who are members of that community for that reason. So it's just something that, that I've tried to keep in mind, and then it's really up to readers to decide whether it's acceptable or not.
Right. So we're at essentially 5:15 now. So we went 15 minutes over, and we still have some questions. But at this point, I think we're going to close the session and thank Dan, not only you and the Bancroft, Charles for everything, but especially the audience for taking the time to listen to this. For those of you who have read the book, thank you. And for those of you who haven't, I strongly recommend getting the book and reading it. It's fabulous. So again, thank you. And any last words, Dan, before we close?
I just want to thank everybody again for supporting the Bancroft. As I said early on, and I don't know if Tom was here at the time, Bancroft, the libraries at Cal are enormously important to me. They've helped shape my life in all kinds of ways. All but one of the books that I've written, I've used resources at the Bancroft, and I couldn't operate. People like me couldn't write books of the sort we write if it weren't for both archives like Tom's, Densho, but also the enormous kinds of resources that the Bancroft makes available. So I just want to thank you all very much for supporting the library. And thanks for joining us. And Tom, I'll talk to you later.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and thank you all. And with that, we'll go ahead and close the show down. Thank you.
Bye-bye.